Hi, my name is Hedy Kober, and I'm a psychologist and a cognitive neuroscientist at Yale University. And if you remember one thing from my talk today, let it be this, that if you want to, you can train yourself to have better self-control. But before I start, I'm going to take a step back and try to define what is self-control. I like to think about it in a few different ways. Self-control, or self-regulation, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably, is what you exercise when you want to change something about how you would otherwise think, feel, or behave in any given situation. And you can think about situations when you need to use self-control as those in which you have options for your emotions, your thoughts, or your behaviors, and you need to exert some effort in choosing one over the other. You might ask yourself, why would I need to exert some effort? Well, typically it's because one option is harder to choose, and that's typically the one that's better for you in the long term. Now, you might have heard self-control defined as a set of problems that differentiate between what's now and what's later. And so the idea is that one of the options comes naturally in this moment, like when you're tempted by cake and you really want to eat it and it looks really good. But the other option is to control yourself, and you need to exert some effort not to be tempted by this cake. Now, self-control can be exercised in different domains, as I've already alluded to. There's control of thought. For example, when you have a persistent thought, maybe about something that upset you, something that didn't go quite as well as you had hoped, maybe someone broke your heart. The control of emotion. Sometimes you have negative emotion. You're angry at someone, you're upset about something, and there are ways that you can reduce that kind of negative emotion. Of course, there's also control of craving or temptation, which is kind of the canonical way that we think about self-control, and one of the ways that I'm going to talk about it today. And then there's a control of behavior, which is really linked to these other forms of control. And this includes how to stay focused on a task, but it also includes choosing to behave in a particular way that's better for you, or stopping yourself from behaving in ways that are slightly less optimal. And the amazing thing is that we have to exercise self-control all the time in many, many different kinds of contexts. For example, you are exercising self-control right now because you're not taking a nap and you're probably not eating cake. You're watching me talk about self-control, and that probably requires some self-control on your part. And to illustrate that, I want you to find more examples of when you've exercised self-control successfully in the last month. So you probably thought of a few times when you've exercised self-control successfully, and you can give yourself a point for each one of these instances. For example, maybe you criticized someone in your head, but you didn't tell them about it because you thought it was going to hurt their feelings. Maybe you were really tired, even exhausted, but you still brush your teeth before bedtime. How about you got irritated walking down the street, someone bumped into you, maybe you were in traffic, but you didn't yell at anybody, you didn't act on it in any kind of way. And all of these are examples of successful self-control, and it's good for you. Of course, the other side of that is also really important. We not infrequently fail at self-control. And the classic way to think about this are times when you've done that recently, right? So maybe you texted while you were driving, or you were tempted to eat dessert even when you thought you shouldn't. And what you can see from both kinds of these examples is that self-control is part of almost everything that you do, and that you do this with varying levels of success, but that it's something that is central and really important to many, many aspects of your life. And indeed, research has shown repeatedly that being able to exercise self-control effectively is associated with long-term health, long-term happiness, and long-term success. And it doesn't mean that exercising self-control in a particular moment would make you happy, but people who exercise self-control in general tend to behave more consistently with their long-term goals and are typically happier and healthier as a result. And the first set of experiments that really showed that nicely was Walter Mischel's marshmallow test experiments. And in these experiments, kids are put in a room in front of a table where a marshmallow or a cookie are presented, and they're given a choice. You can either eat the marshmallow now, or you can wait 15 minutes and get 2 marshmallows. And for kids, marshmallows are really exciting. They love marshmallows. If you've ever met kids, you know that's true. And so for them, the temptation to eat the marshmallow or the cookie right now is really high. And the question is, of course, can they regulate their craving? Can they control their behavior and delay their gratification? And before I tell you what the answer is, I want you to think back. For when you were a kid, 3 or 4 or 5, just like the kids in these experiments, do you think you'd be able to wait for a second marshmallow or a second cookie? Well, I wanted to know what the answer was for me, and I thought about it, and I wasn't exactly sure. And so I called my mother, and my mother said this. She said, "You were so stubborn as a child that maybe to prove a point, you might have waited, but you also had a really, really hard time delaying gratification." And then she thought about it another moment, and she said, "And if it was pretzels, there was no way that you would have waited because they were your favorite." And of course, I'm just one example, but the idea is that there's variability. And the results in these experiments were exactly that. Kids varied in their ability to wait. Some kids couldn't wait at all. As soon as the experimenter left the room, immediately they ate the cookie or they ate the marshmallow. Other kids managed to wait the entire 15 minutes, and at the end of the experiment, they got 2 cookies or 2 marshmallows. But the second and really, really important finding is that the number of minutes that kids waited ended up predicting a whole host of outcomes for their lives. They were better rated by their teachers in school just a few years later. They got better SAT scores in high school. They made more money. They didn't go to jail and didn't use as many drugs when they were in their 20s and 30s. So many, many long-time successes were associated with better self-control. And I'll get back to these experiments in just a few minutes to make another point, but what we can learn from this now is that the ability to exercise self-control is incredibly important, has great implications for life. And in fact, a recent set of experiments has shown that self-control is a better predictor of school performance in kids than even IQ. And as a researcher, as soon as I realized how important self-control was, I knew that we needed to find out more about how it works. And I started reading a lot about it. And one of the metaphors that I came to really like was the metaphor of self-control as a mental muscle. And I really like it because self-control ends up being like a mental muscle in 3 important ways. The first way is that if, in any given moment, if you exercise the right technique or the right strategy, you can lift much heavier weights. You can do a lot more with this muscle. The second way is that this muscle doesn't have infinite capacity. It's somewhat limited. If you use the muscle a lot earlier in the day, you might have less ability to use it later in the day, just like with real muscles. And the third thing is really cool, I think, potentially the most amazing, which is you can teach yourself or train yourself to have much stronger mental muscle of self-control that will allow you to do much more over time. Okay, let's break it down. So the first was technique, right? And the idea is that if you learn the right technique and exercise it in the moment, you can exhibit much better self-control. There are already strategies you can set up ahead of time to ensure that you'll have better self-control. And one such strategy is to use reward substitution. Maybe there's something that you don't want to do. You can promise yourself a reward instead of the task itself. Or in my case, for example, every time that I submit my taxes, I take myself out to a really nice dinner at my favorite restaurant. Another way to do this is to set a contract ahead of time with yourself, sometimes called Ulysses contracts, where if you don't do something that you maybe want to do or need to do, you will incur some kind of penalty. So a friend of mine, for example, has a deal with her husband. If she doesn't go to the gym 3 times a week, he ends up donating to the charity that she really, really doesn't like. And so this motivates her to go to the gym. But we can't use this for everything, right? Imagine you're already at dinner, you didn't set up a contract, but you really want to make sure that you don't get tempted by this luscious, wonderful cake that just arrived at your table. How do you do this? Is there a way in the moment to control your craving and delay your gratification? Well, it turns out that even from these Walter Mischel marshmallow experiments, we know that that's true, right? Some kids could really wait as much as 15 minutes. And so adults must be able to do that as well. Well, the cooler finding, I think, in these marshmallow experiments is that even the kids who couldn't wait, if the experimenter taught them some strategies right then and there, suddenly they were able to wait much longer. Can we do the same thing with adults? Well, the first thing that's difficult to do with adults is to get them to really want marshmallows. So we can't get them to want to devour marshmallows, but we can tempt them with other kinds of foods. And this is really how food commercials work, right? You see an ad for this creamy, beautiful ice cream, and you think to yourself, that looks so good. I want to eat that right now. And so that's exactly what I did in some of the experiments that we ran in my lab. We show people pictures of food. We show cigarette smokers pictures of cigarettes. We take individuals who smoke crack cocaine and we show them pictures of crack cocaine and other people smoking crack cocaine. And what results is a state of craving. They're really tempted. They want to eat. They want to smoke. What we do then is we teach them a very simple strategy for regulation of craving. We call this the regulation of craving task, or the ROC task. And what we tell them to do is we tell them to think about all the reasons that they have not to eat the chocolate cake, not to smoke cigarettes, not to smoke crack, right? Think about the negative consequences that they might incur if they engage in this behavior. So for example, if I were a participant in my own experiment and I saw a picture of chocolate cake, I might think to myself, well, it looks really good, but if I eat it, It might be bad for my weight. It will probably, over time, raise my blood pressure, be bad for my health. I might have higher risk of diabetes. It's really bad for me. I really, really don't want to do this. Not to mention, I might feel bad about myself if I eat this cake. And what did we find? We found that when individuals use this strategy to regulate their craving, they actually reported much lower craving. And even more than reporting lower craving, they reported they wanted to eat this food less, they wanted to smoke less, they wanted to engage less in these behaviors when they thought about these consequences. And then when we looked at their brain activity, what we found is that using these techniques allows them to recruit parts of their brain, the prefrontal cortex, which we know is associated with better self-control. And in turn, what we saw is a reduction in brain activity in regions of their brain that we know give rise to craving. So in using these strategies, they were better able to control their craving, and they were able to change the way that their brain worked in that moment. Now, of course, this didn't work perfectly. It didn't work for everybody, but it worked for a lot of our participants. And so this is something that you might want to try next time you're in that kind of situation. Now, the second thing that makes self-control like a mental muscle is the fact that the ability of this muscle might be limited. For example, when you go to the gym, you can maybe do a certain set of exercises with the same muscle, but you can't really go on forever. And maybe after you finish being at the gym, you can't really lift as many heavy boxes as you would if you hadn't gone to the gym and exercised your muscle. Well, self-control turns out to be similar. There's now many, many studies that have shown that when you use self-control, later in the day, you might have a little bit less self-control available. And there are different ideas about why this happens, but either way, what I want to tell you today is that you can really anticipate that this is going to happen. Notice when you feel like, people call this depleted, and that there are things that you can do to make this better. So for example, one finding is that if people pace themselves, knowing that you have to go to dinner tonight and exercise self-control in the face of dessert, you can pace yourself throughout the day and not use as many of your self-control resources so that you have some spare left. The second thing is that people found that positive emotion reversed this effect of depletion. So if you feel like you've already exercised a lot of self-control, maybe you don't have a lot left right in this moment, you can watch a funny movie. It turns out that after this funny movie, a lot of people show kind of a return of this self-control strength. The third finding that had come out fairly recently is the idea that individuals who believe that exercising self-control won't deplete them don't get quite as depleted. And you can try to do this in your own time. The third, and I think most amazing way in which self-control is like a muscle is the fact that you can train it. Now, we know from clinical psychology that there are treatments that help individuals exercise better self-control. For example, in a treatment called cognitive behavioral therapy for addictions or substance use disorders, individuals who use drugs learn how to use the same strategy that I told you about just a few minutes ago to reduce their craving for drugs and reduce their drug use. And indeed, that kind of treatment is one of the best treatments we have for addiction. And in a finding from Kathy Carroll's lab at Yale, we recently learned that those individuals who learn how to use a strategy the best at the end of treatment are also those individuals who end up using the least drugs and doing the best over time. We also have shown that individuals who undergo this treatment actually show changes in the prefrontal cortex from before to after treatment, where their prefrontal cortex actually becomes more efficient after treatment, so more able to carry out these self-control operations. But of course, these treatments are complex and they're long. They're often happen over the course of several months. What about briefer training in self-control? Can that help if you don't go through an entire treatment that have other kinds of components to it? Well, luckily, we have evidence now that there's shorter kinds of training that you can do to improve your self-control. For example, in a series of studies that we recently completed in my lab, we've shown that with half an hour of training, using that kind of strategy that I told you about, we can train cigarette smokers to regulate their craving. And over the course of the next 2 weeks, with just half an hour of training, they report smoking a lot less. So we are able to help individuals control their smoking by training them and using this particular strategy. Now, of course, this is a very direct kind of practice, right? You practice using a strategy to regulate your craving, and you get better at regulating your craving, and you smoke less. But it turns out that there's also indirect training that you can do. And training in small acts of self-control can also strengthen your self-control muscle and help you have better self-control in general. So what are some examples? Some researchers have asked people to turn open doors or open cabinets for an entire week with their non-dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, you would do this with your left hand. If you're left-handed, you would do this with your right hand. And it turns out that at the end of this week, people were better at exercising self-control in general. Other kinds of exercises include going to the gym regularly, refraining from eating sweets, and even using a hand grip. All of these kinds of trainings improve self-control in general. Of course, nothing that I told you today will help you if you're missing one key ingredient, and that is the motivation to change. Well, it turns out that if you don't have the motivation to change, how are you going to learn the right techniques? And if you do have the motivation to change, not only can you learn the right techniques, but you can apply them in the moment. You can prepare yourself for being depleted and counteract it if you need to. And of course, practice, practice, practice to increase your self-control. This is the one thing that you are supposed to remember from this lecture. If you want to, you can work to have better self-control. And to illustrate this importance of motivation, I'm going to tell you the one joke that I know to tell. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? One, but only if the light bulb really wants to change. Thank you, and good luck.